I want to tell you the stories about my grandma, Katie. And she actually grew up on a farm just a few miles from here, just north of where we are today at the Heritage Center. We're actually at this house. And so I want to tell you what happened, what her childhood was like.
Who lives on that farm now?
And who lives on that farm now?
Who lives on that farm now?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand if you live on that farm now.
And I was
You live on that farm now.
Peter and Peter, Bethany, and their children. Yeah, who?
It's our house.
Okay.
That's their
And
home.
Rose lives on that land too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, where did keep going here?
Okay,
And
so
just for specificity of grandmother, this is your mother's mother.
my mother's mother, and her name was Katie. So you're coming to Katie's farm, and if you come to Katie's farm in the early morning, you're going to see her running out to the hen house to gather the eggs. And she's wearing a big wide skirt for running. She's wearing, what's on her head? What is this?
Bonnet.
You got it. It's a bonnet. Some people say hat. Can you believe it? I tell them it's a sunbonnet. My goodness. So yeah, she's wearing a sunbonnet. You know why? Why a sunbonnet?
It's hot.
Keeps the sun out of her eyes. Yeah. So that's what she's wearing. And she goes out to the hen house and she's gathering the eggs. Now, do you think the chickens like it when she's reaching under them and grabbing their eggs from the straw?
No.
No. And they're going whoop, 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 and flapping their
What was
wings. And flapping their wings and making a big dusty mess. And then she's going to slop the hogs. What do you think that means? Take the garbage out to the hogs. Absolutely. Then she's probably working in the garden. She might be helping with cows. She might be out in the field. She's probably ending up in the kitchen where everything gets spilled, you know, when you're in the kitchen sometimes when you're very young. And at the end of the day, do you know what she does? She takes off her dirty apron and look at that. She's got a clean dress underneath. How smart is that? Now you know why people wear aprons, sometimes in kitchens in restaurants, sometimes in the kitchen in their house. So those are things that Katie was doing, but you know what else her family was doing? Where's the jar?
There's a jar, maybe Jude, is there a jar beside you in the chair?
Oh, yeah. It's down here.
Took my
Audience
Oh
participation.
my goodness,
All right.
thank
And
you.
then-
Her family, like most of the families in the valley, take questions later if we have time. Like most of the families in the valley, they were growing wheat. Not many people do now. It's so hilly with big machines it wouldn't work. But people were growing wheat in the fields in the valley. And so was Katie's family. They were working hard, but I'll tell you another thing they were doing that was really hard work. Now this is a sewing basket. You might think that's the hard work I'm talking about. Well, it was. This basket was Katie's sewing basket. She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me. But we've got something in it that is not sewing things. It's something you have never seen before. Now, if you've seen it before and you know what it is, shut up. But if you haven't seen it before, I want you to see if you can guess what in the world is this? What?
Just call
It's-
out. What do you
okay.
think it is?
Horsehair.
It's
Horsehair?
not horsehair.
No, not horsehair.
Yes.
Good guess.
Not a tail.
Wig.
If you
If
know.
you
Looks
know,
like a-
hush.
Yeah, you can't say if you know.
Miriam, any ideas?
You've never
She
seen
saw the video.
Oh, okay, then you probably know. Okay, it's not a sticky wig or an animal's tail. It's not corn. It's not straw. It's not hay. It's not. People have a lot of good guesses,
You guess?
but do you know what this? Do you have any idea what this is?
I remember, but I forget.
Yeah, that's how it is.
I have that problem.
Yeah. So this is one of the most precious things that we have, and it was kept in the attic of my grandma Katie's house for many years, and it's the last one left from their farm. They were growing flax. And flax is a tall grass. And do you know what you do with your flax? When you cut down the tall grass, somebody told me this after I was telling a flax story and didn't know very much. She said, you know what you do? You cut down your flax grasses and you throw it in the pond. You come back 3 months later. What has happened in those 3 months? You know what's happened?
It's so
The outside part of the grass has rotted away, and inside is this incredible strong fiber. This is like linen thread, but not quite yet. So you take this and you stretch it and spin it on your spinning wheel, and then you weave it back and forth on your loom, and it makes a very strong material called linen. Do you know people find pieces of linen in old graves that are 1,000 years old because linen is so strong? That's what they were making on the farm. So what do you make with your linen when you've woven it into a strong fabric? Can you think?
clothes.
You can make clothes. You can make aprons, shirts, pants. You can make your
Sheets.
bed linens, sheets and pillowcases. That's why they're called linens. Sheets and pillowcases, tablecloths and napkins, aprons, probably sunbonnets, all kinds of things. out of this strong linen that you're making from growing flax on your farm. Boy, were they working hard. Everybody was working so hard on Katie's farm. And then what happened? They heard that people were talking about a war. What? A war? Where people would get killed and scary things would happen? What was going on? You will learn a lot more when you're older, but I'll just tell you this much right now. People disagreed about slavery, and slavery was when one person could own another person and make them work hard all the time, never pay them, control their life completely, even tear them away from their family, and it was very cruel. It's one of the saddest things that ever happened in this country. Some people had slaves and other people believed it was wrong. Now, Katie's family were Mennonite, and Mennonites and brethren in this community believed that slavery was wrong. They believed that Jesus taught us to treat other people the way we would want to be treated and to love other people. And they also believed that if you vote for slavery and you want to go to war to have slavery, that you would be killing people, whereas Jesus said, love, even your enemies. Do good to people who are trying to hurt you. Whoa, how do you do that? That's hard, but that's what the Mennonites and the brethren in this community believed. So it came time for a vote, and you know, people were going to vote either yes, to be able to have slavery, even go to war, or no, that slavery is wrong and we don't want war. So Katie's father, do you think her mother could vote? No, she couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote yet, but her father could vote. And he could have just stayed home and been quiet, but you know, he wasn't that kind of person. We know a lot of stories about him. He was not that kind of person. He was very outspoken, but he decided to go down and vote. It was scary to go down and vote. There were people who were so mad about this. They would chase you down, threaten you, and even brought some people back and made them change their vote. What a terrible thing. Katie's father walked down to the polling station, and he walked in, and they said, Jacob Wanger, how do you vote? And he said, I vote no. And then he did something really unusual. Sometimes I tell people as a lawyer, I think it's really amazing because he was thinking like a lawyer. He wanted to have written evidence of what he had done that day. He said, I want a piece of paper, a notarized statement that states how I voted today. So they gave it to him. He took that piece of paper and he put it in his pocket, and I'll tell you later what he did with it. So most people voted yes, and there was a war. And there were soldiers all over the place. And the soldiers who are not at home and don't have a kitchen are coming into anybody's house to get food. Katie's family knew another family that had just baked a loaf of bread. And the soldiers came by and they walked in the house, and oh, they could smell that bread. They were ready to pick it up. And you know what? They looked and they looked and they looked, and they couldn't find any bread. They searched the whole house. They turned it upside down. And you know what? They actually finally gave up and left. And guess where that loaf of bread was?
Where?
Underneath the baby in the cradle. Oh my goodness! Who thought of that? Maybe somebody young like you thought about where we could hide the loaf of bread. Maybe the baby was sleeping and nobody looked. Maybe the baby was stinky and nobody wanted to look. I don't know. But that family got to eat their bread. Something really amazing happened at Katie's house during the war when all these soldiers were around. There were soldiers at, leave out the baby story.
Okay.
So there were soldiers camping on their farm, but they had done something really surprising, and I don't know if any other families did it or if lots of families did it, but I can tell you that Katie's family in that brick house that you know, they cleared all their furniture out of their living room. And then they shut the door and they put a big dresser in front of that door in the hallway. And then they went outside, and through the window they poured their grain into this big empty room, down onto the floor, out to the edge of the wall, out to up the side of the wall, until that whole room was full of
Because
grain.
the grain was their food. They would grind
That
it
was
up
their
later to
food.
make bread.
Grind it to make flour, you
Forgot-
use
I
flour
left
to make everything you eat.
I left that part out. Yeah, sorry. So this was their grain for eating, and what I should have showed you was down the road is the Brenneman Mill, and you see a brown wheel on the side.
That grinds the-
What is that?
That
I
grinds
saw
the
it
water.
before.
Yes, you saw that before?
It's the
It's a water wheel.
Because
So, yeah.
it's because when I was ice skating, we saw a sheep, and on the way I saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
saw that house.
you
Yes.
saw the mill.
Yeah.
How cool.
So when you take your grain down to the mill, that water wheel is free energy. It's turning the water wheel around, and inside there are great big gears that are hooked up to big grinding stones that come from a special quarry in France. That's the best. And those stones are grinding and grinding, and this wheat turns into nice, soft flour. What do you think you can make with nice, soft flour? What do you think?
Bread.
You can make bread and biscuits and muffins, even cakes and pies. You can make a lot of things to eat. And that's what Katie's family needed to do during this time when there were soldiers all around. So here you heard they poured their grain in through the window into this big empty living room and up the walls. And when the soldiers came walking into their house, the soldiers walked right past the dresser, nice dresser, and they didn't know that behind that dresser was a closed door, and behind that door was a whole room full of grain. And they could eat. They could go to their basement and open a little hole and let some grain come down into a bag, and then take that bag and go right down the road to the Brenneman Mill, and they could eat through the war. So, near the end of the war, soldiers from the north came down to this valley because there was so much grain here, and they wanted to get rid of all the grain that was feeding the soldiers and making the war keep going. So they came down to burn everybody's barn. Now that's scary for everybody, because that's where your animals are, that's where your grain might be, that's where your equipment is. You need your barn to run your farm. How scary was that? They came down here to burn the whole barns in the Shenandoah Valley. And they came to this mill right down the road from Katie's farm. There was a barn there, and they came to this family. And when they came, already they had lit a bunch of barns on fire, and people were scared and watching out where they could see smoke, and they knew barns were burning everywhere. And Mrs. Shaver came out to meet them, because Mrs. Shaver and her husband were the farmers. And she came out to meet them, and you know what? She knew what they were coming to do. Do you think they were her enemies? Yeah, they were going to really harm her. And you will not believe what Mrs. Shaver did. She was a Brethren woman, and she believed the same as the Mennonites, that Jesus said, do good to people who are trying to hurt you. Do good to them. So they're coming. She knows what they're coming for, and you'll never guess what she did. She walked out to meet them with her pies. Delicious pies. You bet they were hungry. She walked out and she offered them her pies. You know what they did? They said, we're sorry that we were ordered to burn down your barn, but we'll light it and we'll leave quick. So they did. They lit it on fire and they galloped away. And she had a broom and she was beating out the fire, but you know what? It was burning pretty fast, and Mrs. Shaver was 80 years old, and her husband was sick in bed, and she was really scared. She was not going to beat this fire. And she rang the gong, and guess who heard it? Jacob, Katie's father. He was up on the hill watching all these fires. He heard her gong, and he knew what it meant, and he and some others went racing over the hill. It's a hill right up behind where you live.
Right behind
And
Peter's house.
he went running down with the others, and they put out the fire, not in time to save the barn, it's gone. But they put out the fire in time to save the mill, which is why it's still there, and you can see it. So I'll tell you one more thing that happened during the burning. The soldiers came to Katie's farm. You know what they came to do, right?
Burn.
To burn down the barn. And when they walked in the lane, you can't imagine, what did Katie's father do? He knew exactly what they were coming for. He had been watching all these fires. He pulled this piece of paper out of his pocket, and he walked out to meet them, and he handed them the piece of paper. 3 times that day, groups of soldiers came to burn down his barn, and 3 times they didn't burn down the barn. To his lane, he walked out to meet them, and he showed them the piece of paper, and his son watched. And remember that one of the times they patted him on the back. But each time they looked at that piece of paper, and do you remember what it said? Jacob Wenger voted no. Exactly. They said, you voted no to slavery and no to the war, so we won't burn down your barn. So I took a picture that I can show you before you leave today in about 2 minutes. And this or 4 copies, 5 copies, it's all the same. So I'll just throw them out here. This is the little barn that they didn't burn down. And we are so happy because this little barn reminds us that our great-grandfather stood up for what he believed. That Jesus taught us slavery was wrong and war was wrong. And he stood up for what he believed, and they didn't burn down that barn.
Children play in that.
Peter's backyard.
Hand it back
Peter
here.
and Bethany.
You can
had
actually
that
tell
barn.
where it is.
Here, pass it back.
So that's the story of the mill and the story of the barn.
We're not fighting. So one day, the soldiers came onto Jacob Weiner's farm. And everybody knew that when the soldiers came onto your farm, you had to give them whatever they wanted. If they wanted food, you gave them food. If they wanted grain, horses, whatever, they took it. So you had to obey whatever they said.
What soldiers? The southern ones?
No, these are the northern, right. So these are Union soldiers, so it was the North against the South. And Virginia was which? South or North?
South.
South. Virginia was South. It was part of the Confederacy. Again, you'll learn more about this later. So it was a big deal to say, no, we're not going to be part of the Southern War against the North. So the soldiers from the North, Union soldiers, came onto the farm, and the first thing they did was they looked at Barbara, who was the older sister of our grandmother Katie. That would be your great-great-grandmother Katie. And she was holding baby Tim. And the head of the soldiers looked at her and said, "Give me that baby." And she was pretty scared because, of course, she had to do whatever they said. So she handed her little baby brother over to that soldier. And you know what he did?
What?
He held that baby. And then he took the baby and he handed it to a soldier right behind him. And that soldier held the baby. And then that soldier handed that baby back to the soldier behind him, and he held the baby. And on back it went until all of those soldiers had held baby Tim. And then the head, the general, the commander came back with baby Tim and handed the baby back to Barbara. And by now the mother had come out and she was pretty worried. And he said, "We missed our families. We just needed to hold a baby." And so that was the story of these Union soldiers that you hear about that were so mean and scary. But this is a moment in all of that in which you realize, you know what, they're just like your moms and dads, right? They love you. And if they were gone for a long time, they would miss you so much that they might ask to hold a baby for a while. Pretty neat. So that's a story about our Uncle Tim, which would be your great Uncle Tim or something like that, right? Okay.
The only reason they were fighting this war was because they thought slavery was worse than war.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
And there were many other complicated issues, but we're not going to get into those right now. So I'm going to tell a story. And again, some of you have heard this story, but it's going to end a little differently than you're used to hearing it. So again, this is Alan and Kathy and Ruth and me, Helen. We're the old ones here. And our mother and father were Grant and Ruth. And we're telling stories right now from Ruth's side. And I'm going to tell a story about George. So George and Katie got married. And you've heard stories about Katie's stories from the valley. Now you're going to hear stories about George. And George, let's say where George and Katie got married. George and Katie got married at somebody's house here. Who could it be? Peter's house. Peter's
Mine's
house.
always had our
Right? So your great-great-grandmother got married in the house where Peter lives, right here. So George's mother was named Susanna. And this is a story and kind of a song, both, about Susanna. And it takes place in the valley and in other places. In the valley of Virginia, my great-grandmother Susanna met and married Henry Brunk. they had a son, but not long thereafter, the Civil War broke out. Now here it was called the Great Burning. And you heard Ruth talk about the Great Burning, when the Union soldiers from the north came down and burned every barn in a 100-mile wide swath, right down the center of the Shenandoah Valley. Now Henry believed that killing was wrong, and so he went with 69 other young men, riding out of the war zone, hoping to escape. They were captured by Confederate soldiers who demanded that they surrender their arms. They surrendered their Bibles. The Confederate soldiers took their horses and put the men in prison. And they gave them 3 choices. 1, you can put on uniforms and take up arms. 2, you can haul supplies as a non-combatant. Or 3, stay in prison. Now, Henry had a young wife and a baby son. What was he to do? He decided he would be a non-combatant. But Henry's conscience still bothered him. He felt that he was still a part of this. A non-combatant is somebody who is in the war, is part of the army, but they just don't fight. But you're still part of the army.
You do other jobs, but
You do other jobs, but you don't handle a gun.
So you like, but just to be clear, they were being a non-combatant with the South.
Yes, because he was in the South.
Hauling supplies.
Yeah, hauling supplies. But Henry's conscience still bothered him. He felt that he was still a part of the machinery of war. One day, he simply left his team of horses in the field and walked out through the orchard and the woods, a deserter, with a price on his head. He hid in attics of friends and neighbors, weaving willow baskets to earn money, while Susanna, pregnant, cared for their son John. One day she gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, but not long thereafter, their son John died. Henry heard the news, and he knew that the Confederate scouts would be there at the funeral to try to track him down. So he stood in the back like a stranger, with his hat pulled down, leaving before the last hymn was sung. And Susanna stood alone at their son's grave. Henry and 17 other young Mennonite men managed to escape to the north. And Henry sent a message to Susanna. Meet me in Maryland, in Hagerstown. She put her possessions in a spring wagon and set out with her baby and her sister. They rode northward into war territory. Suddenly, they were surrounded by Confederate soldiers who seized Susanna's horse. As they were unhitching, she kept clinging to the bridle. I ask you, leave hands off my horse. See, I'm trying to piece together a lot of stories here. And then someone shouted, "Wait, Yanks, the Yanks are coming, follow us." And she said, "No, I'll do no such thing." She pulled back the reins and kept riding northward. She arrived at Harper's Ferry, where she only needed to cross the bridge over the Shenandoah River that would take her to safety, to her beloved. But the bridge before her was burning. She couldn't go backward because Confederate soldiers were behind her trying to seize her horse, and she couldn't go forward because the bridge was burning. And then a miracle occurred. It was like a fairy tale. A miller appeared and showed her a place where it was safe to cross, and she plunged her wagon into the Shenandoah. Did her sister say, stop, wait, I don't know how to swim? Did the baby cry? Was the baby nursing? Was the baby sleeping? We don't know. She just kept crossing the mud, schlucking up the horses. They're panting, they're pulling. Maybe they get stuck. Maybe she cracks a whip. They have to go. She has to move. She has to get to the other side. And she makes it. She makes it to the other side, and she climbs up the other bank, and she rides towards Hagerstown until she is there. But she has no idea where Henry is. He could be anywhere. She rides up and down the street. She looks from left to, and it is the horse that stops, smells something. He knows before she does. She turns and looks in a store window at a shoemaker repairing shoes. He looks up, and their eyes meet. And she's reunited with Henry. Now, this is the part most of you haven't heard. I would actually like to end the story right there, but I can't. 5 years after they were reunited, they and their 6 children by now moved to Kansas, where, guess what? The government has promised free land for the taking. And so they travel west in a covered wagon, but their journey is difficult because even though the Civil War is over, the emotions are still very high. And the people in the formerly slave state of Missouri do not want Susanna and her family, who are on their way to the free state of Kansas, to drink from their wells. And so Susanna and her family have to drink from streams and ponds. When they arrive in Kansas, Henry unhitches the horses, makes a wigwam shelter made of boards, and lies beneath it. He never got up again. He died of typhoid fever. In the next 6 months, 3 of Susanna's 7 children died of typhoid fever. And I've been there at their graves in Kansas. I've stood there in the middle of the vast Kansas plains. They're just small gravestones, flat, lying there. For Fanny, Sarah, and new baby Henry Jr., whose marker reads,
That baby.
budded on earth to bloom in heaven. But the wail you hear is not from Susanna. Sweetheart, can you be a little bit quieter? Thanks. The wail you hear is from the women of the Osage Nation, who are forced with their families to leave their villages on the Kansas plains from the very place where I am standing.
These would be
Suzanne
known
is
to
home.
you probably as Indians. though.
Yes, Native Americans,
Indians,
indigenous
Native
people,
Americans,
yeah,
people.
yeah.
Indians, the Osage.
And they were a nation
Tribe.
called the Osage Nation. And this is a story I learned only recently, in the last few years when I visited the Mennonite community in Kansas. And it's a story that my family, right here, and my community has yet to really acknowledge. The Osage people were forced for the 3rd time in 100 years to leave their land, their homes. Their story of suffering, courage, and survival was never told. Never told to us, and not learned by my great-grandmother, who would have refused to chase them out, right? I mean, being a pacifist, she would not have moved them away, but she nevertheless settled on their land just a few years after they, the Osage people, have been banished from it. But the Osage women did not leave quietly, because it is said that their wails, as they were marched away, could be heard for miles. Can you hear them? Can you hear them?
Hear what?
So this is a story that has nothing to do with the war whatsoever. Jacob Wenger had a good friend who would work with him, whose name escapes me.
Henry.
Henry, do you know the last name?
No.
And they would go down, in the middle of a workday, they would go down to the stream below Peter's house to drink, to tank up. And on the way down, and they loved to play pranks on each other. These guys were jokesters, they were messing with each other all the time. And on the way down there, Jacob noticed a dead snake. And so he put it on the path behind him so that on the way back up, it would startle Henry. And they get down to the stream, and I believe Jacob goes to drink first. And the way you drank from a stream at that time was you wouldn't try to scoop at the water, because that would muddy it. The stream only had, this much clear water at the top of it.
Yeah.
So you didn't want to get down there and stir it up. What you do is you lay down very carefully
Yeah.
and suck water off the top of the
Yeah.
stream.
Okay.
And while Jacob was sucking water, Henry dunked him. And so, of course, while Henry was drinking from the stream, Jacob dunked him. And by the time they were walking back up, Jacob had forgotten about the own snake he'd put there and scared the tar out of himself.
Oh, where did you get this story?
Stories my father told us by.
Oh, Solomon.
Yeah.
Solomon was the child who wrote. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It's in the back.
But it was Henry who
Some
set the snake.
Crazy people.
It was Henry who set the snake.
Yeah.
Ah.
And dunked his head. He was
You
just
know-
he was having quite a day.
When